Welcome to the Enchanted Library, where we turn the pages of books, beautiful and old, living and magical. It's time to curl up, get cozy, and join us on an adventure. Today we're reading from Beautiful Joe by Margaret Marshall Saunders. Chapter 24, The Rabbit and the Hen. "You had foxes up in Maine, I suppose, Mr. Wood, hadn't you?" asked Mr. Maxwell. "Heaps of them. I always want to laugh when I think of our foxes, for they were so cute. Never a fox did I catch in a trap, though I set many a one. I'd take the carcass of some creature that had died, a sheep for instance, and put it in a field near the woods, and the foxes would come and eat it. When no harm befell them, they would be unsuspecting. So just before a snowstorm, I'd take a trap and put it in this spot. I'd handle it with gloves and smoke it and rub fir boughs on it to take away the human smell. Then the snow would come and cover it up, and yet those foxes would know it was a trap and walk all around it." "What kind of traps were they, Father?" asked Mr. Harry. "Steel ones. They'd catch an animal by the leg and sometimes break the bone. The leg would bleed, and below the jaws of the trap it would freeze, there being no circulation. The people around here use one made on the same principle for catching rats. I wouldn't have them on my place for any money. I believe we shall have to give an account for all the unnecessary suffering we put on animals." "You'll have to answer for some, John, according to your own story," said Mrs. Wood. "I have suffered already," he said. "Many a night I've lain on my bed and groaned, when I thought of the needless cruelties I'd put upon animals when I was a young, unthinking boy." "Tell us some more about the foxes, Mr. Wood," said Mr. Maxwell. "Well, in addition to trapping, we used to hunt them with foxhounds. Sometimes in the early mornings they'd find a track in the snow. The leader for scent would go back and forth to find which way the fox was going. All the time he ran he was silent, but kept his tail aloft, waggling it as a signal to the hounds behind. By and by he would decide which way the fox had gone. Then his tail, still high in the air, would wag more violently. The rest followed him in single file, going pretty slow so that we could keep up to them. Presently they would come to a place where the fox was sleeping for the day. As soon as he was disturbed, he would leave his bed under some thick fir or spruce branches near the ground. This flung his fresh scent into the air. When the hounds sniffed it, they gave tongue in good earnest. While in the excitement of his first fright, the fox would run fast for a mile or two, till he found it an easy matter to keep out of the way of the hounds. Then he, cunning creature, would begin to bother them. He would mount to the top pole of the worm fence dividing the fields from the woods. He would trot along here quite a distance, and then make a long jump into the woods. The hounds would come up, but could not walk the fence, and they would have difficulty in finding where the fox had left it. Scattering in all directions, they made long detours into the woods and fields. As soon as the track was lost, they ceased to bay, but the instant a hound found it again, he bayed to give the signal to the others. All would hurry to the spot, and off they would go, baying as they went. Then Mr. Fox would try a new trick. He would climb a leaning tree and jump to the ground. This trick would soon be found out. Then he'd try another. He would make a circle of 1/4 of a mile in circumference. By making a loop in his course, he would come in behind the hounds and puzzle them between the scent of his first and following tracks. If the snow was deep, the hounds had made a good track for him. Over this he could run easily, and they would have to feel their way along, for after he had gone about the circle a few times, he would jump off the beaten path as far as he could, and make off to other cover in a straight line. Before this was done, it was my plan to get near the circle, taking care to approach it on the leeward side. If the fox got a sniff of human scent, he would leave his circle very quickly and make tracks fast to be out of danger. By the baying of the hounds, the circle in which the race was kept up was easily located. The last runs to get near enough to shoot had to be done when the hounds' baying came from the side of the circle nearest to me, for then the fox would be on the opposite side farthest away. As soon as I got near enough to see the hounds when they passed, I stopped. When they got on the opposite side, I then kept a bright lookout for the fox. Sometimes, when the brush was thick, the sight of him would be indistinct. The shooting had to be quick. As soon as the report of the gun was heard, the hounds ceased to bay and made for the spot. If the fox was dead, they enjoyed the scent of his blood. If only wounded, they went after him with all speed. Sometimes he was overtaken and killed, and sometimes he got into his burrow in the earth, or in a hollow log, or among the rocks. One day, I remember, when I was standing on the outside of the circle, the fox came in sight. I fired. He stopped in the snow and fell dead in his tracks. "Poor little fox," said Miss Laura. "I wish you had let him get away." "Here's one that nearly got away," said Mr. Wood. "One winter's day I was chasing him with the hounds. There was a crust on the snow, and the fox was light, while the dogs were heavy. They ran along, the fox nimbly trotting on the top of the crust, and the dogs breaking through. And every few minutes that fox would stop and sit down and look at the dogs. They were in a fury, and the wickedness of the fox in teasing them made me laugh so much that I was very unwilling to shoot him." "You said your steel traps were cruel things, Uncle," remarked Miss Laura. "Why didn't you have a deadfall for the foxes, as you had for the bears?" "They were too cunning to go into deadfalls. There was a better way to catch them. Foxes hate water, and never go into it unless they're obliged to. So we used to find a place where a tree had fallen across a river, and made a bridge for them to go back and forth. Here we set snares with spring poles that would throw them into the river when they made struggles to get free, and drown them. Did you ever hear of the fox, Laura, that wanted to cross a river, and lay down on the bank pretending he was dead? And a countryman came along and thinking he had a prize, threw him in his boat and rowed across, when the fox got up and ran away?" "Now, Uncle," said Miss Laura, "you're laughing at me. That couldn't be true." "Well," said Mr. Wood, chuckling, "they're mighty cute at pretending they're dead. I once shot one in the morning, carried him a long way on my shoulders, and started to skin him in the afternoon, when he turned around and bit me enough to draw blood." "What other animals did you catch when you were a boy?" asked Mr. Maxwell. "Oh, a number. Otters and beavers. We caught them in steel traps. A mink we usually took in a deadfall, smaller, of course, than the one we used for the bears. The muskrat we caught in box traps, like a mouse trap. The wildcat we ran down like the lucivee." "What kind of animal is that?" asked Mr. Maxwell. "The lucivee is a lynx, an animal of the cat tribe. They used to prowl about the country, killing hens, geese, and sometimes sheep. They'd fix their tushes in the sheep's neck and suck the blood. They didn't think much of the sheep's flesh. We ran them down with dogs. They'd often run up trees, and we'd shoot them. Then there were rabbits that we caught, mostly in snares. For muskrats, we'd put a parsnip or an apple on the spindle of a box trap. When we snared a rabbit, I always wanted to find it caught around the neck and strangled to death. If they got half through the snare and were caught around the body, or by the hind legs, they'd live for some time, and they'd cry just like a little child. I liked shooting them better, just because I hated to hear their pitiful cries. It's a bad business, this of killing dumb creatures, and the older I get, the more chicken-hearted I am about it." "Chicken-hearted, I should think you are," said Mrs. Wood. "Do you know, Laura, he won't even kill a fowl for dinner. He gives it to one of the men to do." "Blessed are the merciful," said Miss Laura, throwing her arm over her uncle's shoulder. "I love you, dear Uncle John, because you are so kind to every living thing." "I'm going to be kind to you now," said her uncle, "and send you to bed. You look tired." "Very well," she said with a smile. Then bidding them all good night, she went upstairs. Mr. Wood turned to Mr. Maxwell. "You're going to stay all night with us, aren't you?" "So Mrs. Wood said," replied the young man. "Of course," she said. "I couldn't think of letting you go back to the village on such a night as this. It's raining cats and dogs. But I mustn't say that, or there'll be no getting you to stay. I'll go and prepare your old room next to Harry's." And she bustled away. The two young men went to the pantry for doughnuts and milk, and Mr. Wood stood gazing down at me. "Good dog," he said. "You looked as if you sensed that talk tonight. Come, get a bone, and then away to bed." He gave me a very large mutton bone, and I held it in my mouth and watched him opening the woodshed door. I love human beings, and the saddest time of day for me is when I have to be separated from them while they sleep. "Now, go to bed and rest well, beautiful Joe," said Mr. Wood, "and if you hear any stranger around the house, run out and bark. Don't be chasing wild animals in your sleep, though. They say the dog is the only animal that dreams. I wonder if that's true." Then he went into the house and shut the door. I had a sheepskin to lie on, and a very good bed it made. I slept soundly for a long time. Then I waked up, and found that, instead of rain pattering against the roof, and darkness everywhere, it was quite light. The rain was over, the morning had come, and the sun was shining beautifully. I ran to the door and looked out. It was a very fine day, but it was early yet, and as I gazed about the house and farm buildings, I could see there was no one stirring. I took a turn about the yard and walked up to the side of the house to glance up at Miss Laura's window. I always did this several times through the night and very early in the morning, just to see that she was quite safe. I was on my way back to my bed for another nap when I discovered two small white things coming down the lane. I stood on the veranda and watched them. When they got nearer, I saw they were a white rabbit hopping along, followed by a white hen. It seemed to be a very strange thing for these two creatures to be together, and why were they coming to Dingley Farm so early in the morning? This wasn't their home. I ran down on the road and stood in front of them. Just as soon as the hen saw me, she fluttered before the rabbit, and spreading out her wings, clucked angrily, and acted as if she would peck my eyes out if I went nearer. I saw that they were harmless creatures, and remembering my adventure with the snake, I stepped aside. Beside that, I knew by their smell that they had been near Mr. Maxwell, so perhaps they were after him. They understood quite well that I would not hurt them, and passed by me. The rabbit went ahead again, and the hen fell behind. It seemed to me that the hen was worried about being in a strange place, and was following the rabbit only because she thought it was her duty and wanted to keep in his company. He was going along in a very queer fashion, putting his head to the ground and rising up on his hind legs and sniffing the air, first on this side, then on the other, and his nose was going all the time. He smelled all around the house till he came to Mr. Maxwell's room at the back. It opened onto the veranda by a glass door, and the door stood ajar. The rabbit squeezed himself in, and the hen stayed out. She watched for a while, and when he did not return, she flew up on the back of a chair that stood near the door, and stuck her feathers all out as if she felt cold or uncomfortable. I went back to my bed, for I knew that they would do no harm. Later in the morning, when I was walking around the house, I heard a great shouting and laughing from Mr. Maxwell's room. He and Mr. Harry had just discovered the hen and the rabbit, and Mr. Harry was calling his mother to come and look at them. The rabbit had hopped to the foot of the bed, and the hen had flown on a table. Mr. Harry was chaffing Mr. Maxwell very much, and telling him that anyone who entertained him was in for a traveling menagerie. They had a great deal of fun over it, and Mr. Maxwell said that he had that pretty white hen as a pet for a long time in Boston. Once, when she had some little chickens, a frightened rabbit that was being chased by a dog ran into the yard. In his terror, he got right under the hen's wings, and she sheltered him and pecked at the dog's eyes and kept him off till help came. The rabbit belonged to a neighbor's boy, and Mr. Maxwell bought it from him. From that day, the hen protected him. She became his friend and followed him everywhere. I did not wonder that the rabbit wanted to see his master. There was something about that young man that made dumb animals just delight in him. When Mrs. Wood mentioned this to him, he said, "I don't know why they should. I don't do anything to fascinate them." "You love them," she said, "and they know it. That is the reason." Chapter 25. A Happy Horse. For a good while after I went to Dingley Farm, I was very shy of the horses, because I was afraid they might kick me, thinking I was a bad dog like Bruno. However, they all had such good faces and looked at me so kindly that I was beginning to get over my fear of them. Fleetfoot, Mr. Harry's colt, was my favorite, and one afternoon when Mr. Harry and Miss Laura were going out to see him, I followed them. Fleetfoot was amusing himself by rolling over and over in the grass under a tree, but when he saw Mr. Harry, he gave a shrill whinny and, running to him, began nosing about his pockets. "Wait a bit," said Mr. Harry, holding him by the forelock. "Let me introduce you to this young lady, Miss Laura Morris. I want you to make her a bow." He gave the colt some sign, and immediately he began to paw the ground and shake his head. Mr. Harry laughed and went on. "Here is her dog, Joe. I want you to like him, too. Come here, Joe." I was not at all afraid, for I knew Mr. Harry would not let me get hurt. I stood in front of the colt, and for the first time had a good look at him. They called him the colt, but he was really a full-grown horse, and had already been put to work. He was of a dark chestnut color, and had a well-shaped body and a long, handsome head, and I never saw in the head of man or beast a more beautiful pair of eyes than that colt had, large, full brown eyes that he turned on me almost as a person would. He looked me all over as if to say, "Are you a good dog and will treat me kindly? Or are you a bad one like Bruno? And will you chase me and snap at my heels and worry me so that I shall want to kick you?" I looked at him very earnestly and wagged my body and lifted myself on my hind legs toward him. He seemed pleased and put down his nose to sniff at me. Then we were friends, and such good friends, for next to Jim and Billy I have loved Fleetfoot. Mr. Harry pulled some lumps of sugar out of his pocket, and giving them to Miss Laura, told her to put them on the palm of her hand and hold it out flat towards Fleetfoot. The colt ate the sugar, and all the time eyed her with a quiet observing glance that made her exclaim, "What a wise-looking colt!" "He is like an old horse," said Mr. Harry. "When he hears a sudden noise, he stops and looks all about him to find an explanation." "He has been well trained," said Miss Laura. "I have brought him up carefully," said Mr. Harry. "Really, he has been treated more like a dog than a colt. He follows me about the farm and smells everything I handle, and seems to want to know the reason of things." "Your mother says," replied Miss Laura, "that she found you both asleep on the lawn one day last summer, and the colt's head was on your arm." Mr. Harry smiled and threw his arm over the colt's neck. "We've been comrades, haven't we, Fleetfoot? I've been almost ashamed of his devotion. He has followed me to the village, and he always wants to go fishing with me. He's 4 years old now, so he ought to get over those coltish ways. I've driven him a good deal. We're going out in the buggy this afternoon. Will you come?" "Where are you going?" asked Miss Laura. "Just for a short drive back to the river to collect money for Father. I'll be home long before tea time." "Yes, I should like to go," said Miss Laura. "I will run to the house and get my other hat." "Come on, Fleetfoot," said Mr. Harry, and he led the way from the pasture, the colt following behind with me. I waited about the veranda, and in a short time Harry drove up to the front door. The buggy was black and shining, and Fleetfoot had on a silver-mounted harness that made him look very fine. He stood gently switching his long tail to keep the flies away, and with his head turned to see who was getting into the buggy. I stood by him, and as soon as he saw that Miss Laura and Mr. Harry had seated themselves, he acted as if he wanted to be off. Mr. Harry spoke to him, and away he went, I racing down the lane by his side, so happy to think he was my friend. He liked having me beside him, and every few seconds put his head down toward me. Animals can tell each other things without saying a word. When Fleetfoot gave his head a little toss in a certain way, I knew he wanted to have a race. He had a beautiful, even gait, and went very swiftly. Mr. Harry kept speaking to him to check him. "You don't like him to go too fast, do you?" said Miss Laura. "No," he returned. "I think we could make a racer of him if we liked, but Father and I don't go in for fast horses. There is too much said about fast trotters and race horses. On some of the farms around here, the people have gone mad on breeding fast horses. An old farmer out in the country had a common cart horse that he suddenly discovered had great powers of speed and endurance. He sold him to a speculator for a big price, and it has set everybody wild. If the people who give all their time to it can't raise fast horses, I don't see how the farmers can. A fast horse on a farm is ruination to the boys, for it starts them racing and betting. Father says he's going to offer a prize for the fastest walker that can be bred in New Hampshire. That Dutchman of ours, heavy as he is a fair walker, and Cleve and Pacer can each walk 4.5 miles an hour." "Why do you lay such stress on their walking fast?" asked Miss Laura. "Because so much of the farm work must be done at a walk. Plowing, teaming, and drawing produce to market, and going up and down hills. Even for the cities, it is good to have fast walkers. Trotting on city pavement is very hard on the dray horses. If they are allowed to go at a quick walk, their legs will keep strong much longer. It is shameful the way horses are used up in the big cities. Our pavements are so bad that cab horses are ruined in 3 years. In many ways, we are a great deal better off in this new country than the people in Europe, but we are not in respect of cab horses, for in London and Paris they last for 5 years. I've seen horses drop dead in New York just from hard usage. Poor brutes. There is a better time coming for them, though. Well, Fleetfoot, do you want another spin? All right, my boy, go ahead." Away we went again along a bit of level road. Fleetfoot had no check-rein on his beautiful neck, and when he trotted he could hold his head in an easy, natural position. With his wonderful eyes and flowing mane and tail, and his glossy reddish-brown body, I thought he was the handsomest horse I had ever seen. He loved to go fast, and when Mr. Harry spoke to him to slow up again, he tossed his head with impatience. But he was too sweet-tempered to disobey. In all the years that I have known Fleetfoot, I have never once seen him refuse to do as his master told him. You have forgotten your whip, haven't you, Harry? I heard Miss Laura say, as we jogged slowly along, and I ran by the buggy panting with my tongue hanging out. I never use one, said Mr. Harry. If I saw any man lay one on Fleetfoot, I'd knock him down. His voice was so severe that I glanced up into the buggy. He looked just as he did the day that he stretched Jenkins on the ground and beat him. I am so glad you don't, said Miss Laura. You are like the Russians. Many of them control their horses by their voices and call them such pretty names. But you have to use a whip for some horses, don't you, Cousin Harry? Yes, Laura. There are many vicious horses that can't be controlled otherwise. And then, with many horses, one requires a whip, in case of necessity, to urge them forward. I suppose Fleetfoot never balks, said Miss Laura. No, replied Mr. Harry. Dutchman does sometimes, and we have 2 cures for him, both equally good. We take up a forefoot and strike his shoe 2 or 3 times with a stone. That operation always interests him greatly, and he usually starts. If he doesn't go for that, we pass a line around his forelegs at the knee joint, and then step in front of him and draw on the line. Father won't let the men use a whip unless they are driven to it. Fleetwood has had a happy life, hasn't he? Said Miss Laura, looking admiringly at him. How did he get to like you so much, Harry? I broke him in after a fashion of my own. Father gave him to me, and the first time I saw him on his feet, I went up carefully and put my hands on him. My mother was rather shy of me, for we hadn't had her long, and it made him shy too, so I soon left him. The next time I stroked him. The next time I put my arm around him. Soon he acted like a big dog. I could lead him about by a strap, and I made a halter and a small bridle for him. I didn't see why I shouldn't train him a little while he was young and manageable. I think it is cruel to let colts run until one has to employ severity in mastering them. Of course, I did not let him do much work. Colts are like boys. A boy shouldn't do a man's work. But he had exercise every day, and I trained him to draw a light cart behind him. I used to do all kinds of things to accustom him to unusual sounds. Father talked a good deal to me about Rarey, the great horse trainer, and it put ideas into my head. He said that he once saw Rarey come on a stage in Boston with a timid horse that he was going to accustom to a loud noise. First, a bugle was blown, then some louder instrument, and so on, until there was a whole brass band going. Rarey assured the animal, and it was not afraid. You like horses better than other animals, don't you, Harry? Asked Miss Laura. I believe I do, although I am very fond of that dog of yours. I think I know more about horses than dogs. Have you noticed Scamp? Oh, yes, I often watch her. She is such an amusing little creature. She's the most interesting one we've got. That is, after Fleetfoot. Father bought her from a man who couldn't manage her, and she came to us with a legion of bad tricks. Father has taken solid comfort, though, in breaking her of them. She is his pet among our stock. I suppose you know that horses, more than any other animal, are creatures of habit. If they do a thing once, they will do it again. When she came to us, she had a trick of biting at a person who gave her oats. She would do it without fail, so Father put a little stick under his arm, and every time she would bite, he would give her a rap over the nose. She soon got tired of biting and gave it up. Sometimes now you'll see her make a snap at Father as if she were going to bite, and then look under his arm to see if the stick is there. He cured some of her tricks in one way, and some in another. One bad one she had was to start for the stable the minute one of the traces went unfastened when we were unharnessing. She pulled Father over once, and another time she ran the shaft of the sulky clean through the barn door. The next time Father brought her in, he got ready for her. He twisted the lines around his hands, and the minute she began to bolt, he gave a tremendous jerk that pulled her back on her haunches and shouted, "Whoa!" It cured her, and she never started again till he gave the word. Often now you'll see her throw her head back when she's being unhitched. He did it only once, yet she remembers. If we had the training of Scamp, she'd be a very different animal. It's nearly all in the bringing up of a colt, whether it will turn out vicious or gentle. If anyone were to strike Fleetfoot, he would not know what it meant. He has been brought up differently from Scamp. She was probably trained by some brutal man who inspired her with distrust of the human species. She never bites an animal, and seems attached to all the other horses. But she really loves Fleetfoot and Cleve and Pacer. Those 3 are her favorite. I love to go for drives with Cleve and Pacer, said Miss Laura. They are so steady and good. Uncle says they are the most trusty horses he has. He has told me about the man you had, who said that these 2 horses knew more than most humans. That was old David, said Mr. Harry. When we had him, he was courting a widow who lived over in Hoytsville. About once a fortnight he'd ask Father for one of the horses to go over and see her. He always stayed pretty late, and on the way home he'd tie the reins to the whipstock and go to sleep, and never wake up till Cleve or Pacer, whichever one he happened to have, would draw up in the barnyard. They would pass any rigs they happened to meet, and turn out a little for a man. If David's wasn't asleep, he could always tell by the difference in their gait which they were passing. They'd go quickly past a man, and much slower with more of a turnout if it was a team. But I dare say Father has told you this. He has a great stock of horse stories, and I am almost as bad. You will have to cry halt when we bore you. You never do, replied Miss Laura. I love to talk about animals. I think the best story about Cleve and Pacer is the one that Uncle told me last evening. I don't think you were there. It was about stealing the oats. Cleve and Pacer never steal, said Mr. Harry. Don't you mean Scamp? She's the thief. No, it was Pacer that stole. He got out of his box, Uncle says, and found 2 bags of oats. He took one in his teeth and dropped it before Cleve and ate the other one himself. And Uncle was so amused that he let them eat a long time and stood and watched them. That was a clever trick, said Mr. Harry. Father must have forgotten to tell me. Those 2 horses have been mates ever since I can remember, and I believe if they were separated they'd pine away and die. You've noticed how low the partitions are between the boxes and the horse stable. Father says you wouldn't put a lot of people in separate boxes in a room where they couldn't see each other, and horses are just as fond of company as we are. Cleve and Pacer are always nosing each other. A horse has a long memory. Father has had horses recognize him that he's been parted from for 20 years. Speaking of their memories, reminds me of another good story about Pacer that I never heard tell yesterday, and I would not talk about to anyone but you and Mother. Father wouldn't write me about it, for he will never put a line on paper when anyone's reputation is concerned. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform and share our podcast with a friend. Visit our website at www.enchantedlibrary.net to see our past books or to connect with us on Facebook. If you'd like to support the work we do, you can visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/enchantedlibrary. We appreciate your support. Until next time, friends, happy reading.